For many a gamer, this month was known as Broketober because of all the new releases. For me, it was Stresstober. A lot of things were on my mind, pivotal changes in my life were up in the air for the new year, and several projects were nearing their deadline, both for this channel and for my full-time job at the time. All this coupled with personal obligations and social commitments on top of the hot new releases, including Spider-Man 2, of which I knew ahead of time that I needed to make some form of video. I wasn't sure how I was going to manage, and my anxiety was getting the better of me. So it was only destiny that a flashback inside of the opening act of the game features Aunt May giving a young and slightly less responsible Peter Parker some poignant words of advice. Life is about balance. This wasn't just a message to Peter's dual identity lifestyle and aiming to always do both when saving the citizen and paying the mortgage at the same time. It was also a form of a mantra, a mission, a Rubicon for developer Insomniac Games to cross in the making of one of the most anticipated sequels of the 9th generation of console gaming. It was also the right words I needed to hear at the right moment. Balance is a journey and not a destination. Perceiving it as the latter was what was causing my anxiety, not realizing I can achieve balance within the moment. Focus on what I want, just like Peter did in Spider-Man 2, was of higher priority, and then dedicating a separate block of time for the other stuff later needed to happen. It's also the healthy excuse as to why this essay took so long to make. So, without any further stress, anxiety, and ado, here's a full critique essay on Spider-Man 2, an unbalanced act. Spider-Man from 2018 and Spider-Man Miles Morales have had exceptional opening acts, cementing the tone, direction, and overall vibe of what you're in for the rest of the game. So how does Spider-Man 2 fare in those first impressions? Well, it definitely knows exactly what you came for. We get a brief Venom tease at the beginning with a wide-angle nightmare Harry is having inside of what is pretty much this game's version of a Bacta-tank from Star Wars, and Peter takes up Miles' advice about being a teacher from the previous game, by becoming a teacher at the exact same high school Miles goes to, and naturally the two are already having a bad time trying to balance a normal life and being Spider-Men. Oh, and Sandman happens to be attacking the city on the same day. Not only is this classic Spidey, but the entire opening segment had this authentic, almost Sam Raimi-like quality to the way it was presented. Yes, it could be my nostalgic bias speaking there, but in the end, I was smiling watching Peter and Miles suiting up on the rooftop to take on a skyscraper-sized sand titan like they simply forgot to take out the trash. It's also this set piece that allows Insomniac to show off their technical prowess and demonstrate how far their skills and tech have come after leaping from the PlayStation 4 to the PlayStation 5, seamlessly transitioning from cutscene to gameplay while an in-world Sandman is rampaging in the distance, and Miles actively swinging by your side, all while reminding you of the basics of traversal, combat, and interactivity, but never feeling too hand-holdy or in your space about it. It's never overly challenging either, even on spectacular difficulty, which is what this playthrough was on. It manages to sponge up the enemies to remind you of how quick to be in combat while also layering the new stuff expectant of a sequel, some of which completely surprised me with how early we get it. Peter already has the mechanical arms from his climactic fight with Otto, Miles has some new Venom powers up his sleeve, and to deliver the final blow to Flint Marko, we have the web wings, a contesting design choice for many, but in the context of a Spider-Man video game, these ugly little things are kind of a godsend. More on them a little later. Newer details and mechanics are showcased after your fight with Sandman to let the player know that this sequel will build on what came before regarding your duties as New York's Spider-Man. You're taught how to use the app, exploring the in-game menus. You actually get to swing with the citizens on your back, which I believe was lifted from the Spider-Man 2 movie game. You can't change my mind on that, I'm sorry. I believe that that's where exactly they took it from. And with a little help from Genki and his friends, which he has you set up via some unique and rather foreshadowing, albeit a little puffy minigames. You are then taught how to get around our favorite returning character, New York City. As typical for any sequel to an open world game, the expected reuse of Manhattan Island appears here with the addition of Brooklyn and Queens as explorable boroughs. But as modern gaming tropes have shown us, open world games aren't made better automatically by just having the said open world be bigger. What helps Spider-Man 2's New York avoid this pitfall is how familiar the design of this fictitious New York is to the first game, yet still somehow manages to be a little different than how we saw saw it before. Though it's not as holiday festive as it was when we saw it last in Miles Morales, the additional greenery in parks, foliage and rooftops, much more lived-in pedestrian activity, the love the devs have for sunsets to bask the windows in that orange glow, cars and highways that honk at you if you get in their way. Yup, it's New York alright, one I never felt was too different or game flipping, but also not too redundant from the prior game to grow tired of swinging through. That is, if you're even swinging at all. New York can only be complimented by how well you can traverse it as a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And my lord, is it so much more improved this time around. Not only is there a better sense of momentum with each swing shot out, but new animations are able to personalize the feel of that swinging, dependent on which version of Spider-Man you're playing, either as Peter or Miles. A function I will admit could have been presented a little better in the Friendly Neighborhood app. I noticed me, as well as many other streamers, instantly forgot how to do it, even after being taught so during the onset of the first opening hours, but once the game programs the feature into your brain via specific story beats, either by only playing Peter-only missions or Miles-only missions, it became kind of second nature. Insomniac took it even further by asking the pivotal question: what can be even cooler while you're swinging? Never in my life would I have guessed that the question would be answered with the web wings. The amount of serotonin surging from my body as I would transition between a consecutive amount of swings into a perfectly timed and elevated web wing glide cannot be described. Time your web swings even better with the strategically placed vertical and horizontal wind tunnels throughout the city, and fast travel becomes almost an ancient concept, even though this is probably the most impressive form of fast travel I've ever seen implemented in a modern video game. I mean, look at the SSD hard at work here. Some web swinging mechanics are reluctantly locked behind some of the upgrades and are not available from the beginning, but trust me, they make the progress and the hard work into acquiring those skills even more worth it. From the slingshot to the center bend to my personal favorite, the loop-de-loop. An essential mechanic if you want to build even more speed than what you had before. Picture it: web swing, loop into a whole circle, launch yourself from that loop, and propel yourself into a wind tunnel, open the web wings right into said tunnel. Pure euphoric web slinging bliss. Combat is also another major beneficiary of those aforementioned upgrades. You do get a taste of it during the Sandman sequence, instructing newcomers of which face button, trigger, and bumper does what, but out in the open is truly where it's at. You know how many people back in 2018 were comparing the original game to Batman Arkham, especially with the counter ability in that game tied to the spider sense? Well, I would like to compare this game more so to Devil May Cry. Layering every ability and gadget to match a strategy actually felt like I was using everything and picked my moves carefully, especially when the game introduces parrying. The parry just simply changes almost everything you knew from the first game. Within a matter of minutes, I was strategizing my moveset and thinking about where I can exhaust certain gadgets, when not to deal certain damage, when to heal and not to heal, and instead use that focus bar on a takedown, which now boasts new animations for both solo and group takedowns when another ally happens to be around. It basically boils down to this: the combat can be simple enough to simply just be button mashy, and I understand if someone perceives it that way, because maybe the parry function doesn't land as, say, that of a Souls game, etc. The aerial mechanics may not be as chaotic as the previously referenced Devil May Cry games, but the counter argument would be, the game is not trying to be those things. Those games that I just referenced felt like inspirations here within the context of still being a Spider-Man video game, and very few mechanics, abilities, and gadgets went underused. Sure, I had my preferences over others, and sadly, it did seem like creating a more layered form of combat design came with its own compromises. Farewell, web bombs and the gadget wheel, I thoroughly knew ye. But it's difficult to not see how the combat and the traversal became stacked over time and polished from what came before, making for more cooler, faster, more arcadey combat scenarios. Insomniac knew that the element of fun was paramount. Upgrade systems are present for both Peter and Miles respectively, but there's even a tree shared between the two Spider-Man. Again, it's the thought that counts. I was thinking to myself, I hope that we don't really have to kind of split these and just decide where one gets prioritized over the other. They have their own shared tree. Sure, it's not the most game-changing upgrade tree we've seen in a video game. There are some basics here we've seen in prior games, and some of those cool traversal and combat mechanics are locked inside of this tree, which I feel wasn't really transparent during the marketing. But every time the game would remind me of one of those tokens and tech parts I had stocked up, which then in turn made abilities and skills available, I wouldn't just spend it willy-nilly. I would actually curate the upgrades to a DMC-like playstyle I adapted of taking enemies to the air and mixing and matching my mech arm moves, venom abilities, and even those alien-based powers we get later as well. Abilities are fun to swap around in the menus, but admittedly I never felt incentivized to do so outside of some specific occasions during story-based endgame fights. And though the bulk of the game made me think carefully of where to spend my points on the upgrade tree, don't rack your brain all that much thinking about it. The chances of you filling up all 3 upgrade trees by the time you run credits is actually pretty high. So don't stress about slowly leveling up. The important thing is that for those few opening hours of the game, everything felt nuanced and balanced. Just like Aunt May told Peter in that flashback, reminding us how both Peter and Insomniac games needed to balance all aspects of what makes being Spider-Man amazing, regardless if you're playing as either Peter or Miles. Hell, even John Paisano came back swinging with a terrific score I'd argue is even better than the first game, making my frustration at his snub for a Game Award nomination a little bit more valid, especially when he's delivering this banger while you free roam in the second act. However, much like how Aunt May flashes from the past to remind us to keep things balanced, 2 powerful forces from both Peter's and Miles' past come back to upset that balance. An opportunity for a better way of life comes knocking at Peter's door, or rather to scare Mary Jane, Harry Osborn. Harry Osborn has always been a major tentpole character in the legacy of Spider-Man, from the comics to the cartoon and then the movies. So to have Insomniac blend his arc with that of the symbiotes, one that has long been attributed to Eddie Brock in the mainline lore, is absolutely rejuvenating. No pun intended there, but Harry's mantra about healing the world, tracing back to his mother's tragedy and his history with Peter in high school, indicated by those flashbacks, instantly makes him a much more compelling character that can be bought as being a best friend to Peter, and making the whole symbiote story arc all the more tragic. This symbiote arc pairs well with Harry not only in the literal sense but also metaphorically, making me almost forget about Eddie Brock having to exist in this universe in the first place. A key strength in making Harry a great supporting character was how Insomniac wrote him to reflect how they see us as players. They don't talk down to us. Harry has a symbiote that gives him abnormal strength. He should probably try to save that woman on the coaster. He finds out Peter is Spider-Man? How about he doesn't act like a total tool because Peter was lying to protect him and instead offers to help him, referencing Agent Venom in the process. Every turn when I thought something would be cool, Insomniac would reciprocate with something cool, a step ahead. Our first interaction with Harry results in a bike ride through town and ending with a stealth mission at Midtown High during a flashback. Later, Peter, Harry, and MJ take a full interactive tour through Coney Island, complete with minigames and even DualSense functionality. Strung throughout the first act of the game, I found myself smiling a lot of these little nuances, both actively and passively. Reformed villains trying to turn over a new life? Miles helping his community? Oh shit, Miles is still in this game. Hey Miles, I kind of forgot about you. Due to Harry's sudden resurfacing, Miles is dealing with his own internal dilemma. Not only does he have a whole 500-word essay for his college application due, that was sarcasm, by the way. 500 is nothing. But only his dad's killer happens to be loose out there after the breakout by Craven's men. Earlier in the story, during a botched prisoner transfer, Martin Lee, aka Mr. Negative, gets broken out. A pivotal event for Miles, as this matter was never truly resolved after the events of the first 2 games. And it only makes sense for Miles to confront his own personal, literal, and metaphorical demons. It just takes way too long and too much to get there Because Lee only manages to break out because of one man and his constant crowbarring into the story. Kraven the Hunter. The worst element of Spider-Man 2. Like the knife sticking out of Peter's side, forcing him to face the darkest chapter in his life as Spider-Man, Kraven forces the game to face its greatest flaws. On a technical level, Kraven ticks all the right boxes. He's jacked, he's designed faithful to his comic look, while modernized for a new audience. The voice actor does an adequate job of sounding like what you'd expect Kraven to sound like, so what's the problem? Kraven, well, winds up on the negative end of the idiom show don't tell, in which Insomniac kept telling us how intimidating Kraven is without ever actually feeling it. Sure, environmental details and security cam footage tells us that he's pretty much off a good chunk of Spidey's rogue gallery villains, but none of them deliver the impact that they intended, often resulting in one-shot kills to the likes of Scorpion and even Peter himself twice. By the time that we really do get to fight him, he mostly just felt like an obstacle rather than a climactic fight, one that is obstructed by the most frustrating environment for a boss fight in the entire game. The only thing we have to hang on to is the lore fed through the comics about how he lives for the hunt, a hunger only sated by taking on the baddest NYC has to offer, including both Spidey's, the symbiote, and Lizard, serving more as just a catalyst for those plot turns to happen rather than being a memorable villain. So naturally, Kraven creates a sort of domino effect for other events in the plot that, while treated with nuance, begin to make that tightrope that Insomniac was walking on sort of tremble. First, let's tackle that symbiote. After a fatal blow delivered by the overly teased Kraven, in a cutscene and not in an endgame boss fight, which might have had a stronger impact, the symbiote slithers off of Harry and restores the raw power inside of Peter to resuscitate him. Thus begins the iconic symbiote arc, and the game wastes no time in introducing his newfound power to the player. Once you're back into the city, you're able to experiment with the new symbiote abilities that have pretty much replaced the mechanical arm abilities before, only with new areas of attack and a new strategy coming up with them. You also get Symbiote Surge, which is pretty much Spider-Man's version of Spartan Rage from God of War. A tad cliche, but effective when getting out of a jam. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel more visceral power when mixing these new powers into the already multi-layered combat strategy I was gushing about before. And I spent more time than I should have taking care of random crime around the city with that black suit. But eventually I noticed that this is where the passive changes to gameplay outside of the narrative structure began and pretty much ended. Black Suit Spider-Man doesn't necessarily look, sound, or move all that different outside in the open world. Only when progressing the main story does the symbiote begin to take hold as tradition dictates, and it's during this phase that the symbiote infects more than just Peter's aggression. It also sort of plagues the game's entire second act as well. In one of the more baffling phenomena I had to explain in a video about a video game, the pacing of Act 2 feels both rushed and slowed down at the same time, while trying to handle a little bit too much as both a comic book adaptation and a superhero video game. Despite Yuri Lowenthal putting in double duty as the optimistic version of Peter Parker and the aggressive black suit counterpart, the transformation between the two versions of the wall crawler feels a little disjointed. One mission he's making bear and honey jokes and doing his best parody of The Hangover with a tiger. The next, he's putting everyone around him in his place as he perceives it. It almost felt like they were checking the boxes at predetermined areas in the story to make sure that the symbiote arc wasn't tampered with. Telling off MJ? Check. Ignoring his friends and partners? Check. Hurting bad guys worse than he was doing before? Check. Saying that the suit makes him a better Spider-Man? Check. The most unique thing about Peter's time with the symbiote is frankly how the whole thing ends. Not only do we get to finally fight Kraven head on in what would have been a clever boss fight if it wasn't for the aforementioned annoying environment design, but the turntables with the inclusion of Miles, electroshocking his way out of the game's oppression to knock some sense into Peter in a rather well executed second boss fight. And just like that, it's over. Despite taking up an entire act of the game, Peter's time with the symbiote still feels rather rushed and compartmentalized, a fear I had when developers revealed prior to the game's release that the campaign would take about the same amount of time to complete as the first. This proved to be a daunting thought at how much the game was already dealing with at that point, let alone a game dealing with two Spider-Men. That tightrope Insomniac was walking is now violently shaking. Let's rewind just a little bit, back to that line where I said that Miles pushed back the game's oppression to jump back into the game's narrative and confront Peter. By this point, Peter wasn't the only one neglecting Miles. The game was doing it too. So much is happening with Peter's symbiote phases from both a story and gameplay level
that I instinctively kept switching back to Peter whenever the game forced me to do a Miles mission. A sentiment I feel genuinely bad about, since Miles is arguably a much more likable and compelling version of himself this time around. Not only is Najee Jeter able to deliver another great performance, but the direction he received this time strikes a perfect balance between being a younger Spider-Man than Peter and one that has also matured since the events of his own spin-off and has been molded by his superheroing experiences. He's also not as high-pitched and, as I previously put it, twangy as he was before. So it was rough for Miles to get the weaker storyline out of the two, the weaker story mission structure, the weaker side quests, hell, even the weaker suits. Why in the hell would you design a suit in the middle of a citywide emergency? Because Adidas said so. The main elements that kept me going was Miles' evolved form of his Venom powers and wondering how his ties to Martin Lee were going to pay off. Some of Miles' missions aren't just meandering in and out of the story, but mainly just serve to set up the side content to complete throughout the city. Prowler's hidden stashes, Mysterio's mysteriums, and his personal takes on the activities you also get to do with Peter, reminiscent of the first game but with a slight little twist. Instead of demon hideouts, you have to take down hunter blinds in each district. Doing so will then reveal one of the main bases in that district. A novel idea at first, but resorted to being a checklist nonetheless. Instead of stable stations, you now use your web wings to take down eagle-like drones used by the hunters to keep tabs on people. A side activity that feels fast and dynamic enough to give us a very naive glimpse into what a Superman game by Insomniac will look like. None of these activities are inherently bad, but they just get lost in the shuffle of a second act that's already doing too much without enough time. Miles taming a robot dog, another flashback of Peter referencing Spider-Man 3, Miles DJing minigame, a Haley side mission complete with spray paint mechanics tied to the DualSense controller. I felt like the old saying, jack of all trades, master of none, was most fitting here. And that's not even counting the prior minigames that were originally baked into the story now becoming side content around New York. Scientific puzzles for the Emily May Foundation, putting Sandman's crystals back together, Robbie's photo ops, a lot I knew I had to do to get the platinum. But unlike Spider-Man 2018, perhaps the game even knew that it was too much to handle. Though not as broken as, say, Arkham Knight on PC during its initial launch, I ran into more than my fair share of bugs and glitches in my first playthrough here than I did when I even first played the original game running on PlayStation 4. Don't get me wrong, there was still a lot happening around the city to keep the momentum and fun factor of the gameplay consistent. The introduction of the web lines you can create adds a new spin on stealth, and the new symbiote skill tree in the upgrades menu along with the new suits unlocked every other level made progression fun to do. But for every step forward there would be a pebble scraping the bottom of the shoe for that step. Creating your own perch takedowns with the do-it-yourself web line is a welcome addition, albeit a slightly late one since by this point, both Peter and Miles are so OP with their symbiote and evolved Venom powers respectively that stealth is almost a bit of an afterthought. A sentiment mildly shared by the game director himself, who admits he subconsciously didn't pay that much attention to incorporating stealth into the overall gameplay. This game takes suit acquisition to a whole new level with over 78 total suits, not including the additional colorways for some of them. Unfortunately, most of them are either carryovers from the last two games or just really aren't that appealing. Even downright ugly. I'm looking at you, Adidas suit. Procedurally generated crime throughout the city still manages to capture my attention and lets me test out any new upgrades I got. But the crime itself mainly boils down to the same hurdle of enemies. It doesn't feel as varied as with the original game, and the thrilling car chases now end in static animations instead of dynamic QTEs. A sacrificial cut likely due to the scope of the open world. The balance held so harmoniously by Insomniac was beginning to wither, and the game was going everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and frankly too fast, with the overall completion percentage rising much quicker than I realized after just a few hours of playtime. The confusion, the aggression, the madness needed to end. Insomniac can be better than that, and they don't need a symbiote suit to know that. It's time to rip it off, and it's time to focus on one commonality, one goal, and one balanced target. And they are Venom. I have a confession to make. I never really sympathized with Eddie Brock. I never really clicked with the notion of Peter causing this downward spiral of misery and depravity, from losing his job to losing his girlfriend to losing his apartment, by one simple act. The closest I felt sorry for him taking this hateful turn via the symbiote was in the Spectacular Spider-Man animated show, and it was because of one simple detail.
he was Peter's close friend. In all prior portrayals, he was just the rival photographer at the Bugle vying for Peter's shot at the staff job. Not much else. In this version from the animated show, there was this established relationship between Peter and Eddie that resonated with the audience. It was charismatic, likable, and made us hurt a little bit when the rift was generated by the symbiote between Peter and Eddie. It turned even more horrific when seeing how Eddie reacts after the arc is over. It made it one of the more memorable Venom storylines outside of the comics. Well, I'm actually gonna tout this one right up there with them because the element of a personal relationship that we can attach ourselves to is present yet again, only this time it's with Harry Osborn instead of Eddie Brock. A bold decision to be sure, but one that manages to stick after Miles finally knocks some sense into both Peter and that bell, and the two managed to get the suit off of Peter after a rather cool, challenging, and kinetic boss fight. After making his apologies and returning to Oscorp, the game wastes no time again to deliver on its final act. Harry is waiting, and so is the symbiote to finally leech off of a host in desperate need of strength and to grow inside of a game in desperate need of focus and balance. Venom is finally here, and it's time to fight. I'll give Insomniac some credit. I love it when developers often take staple elements of their games and then turn them on the player. It's one of my favorite things to see come out of the medium, and Insomniac manages to subtly prank us with that slight zoom out of the camera before Norman interrupts. But well, wait, Peter is out cold. Extra security is here, and the cutscene has been going on for a while now. Can it be? Could Insomniac really deliver on what many were only simply just tossed up to wishful thinking? Are they really going to achieve on what many perceive to be a very skeptical feat? And there it was. Just the right combination of characters to make many a gamer pause and either get up from their chair, sink their head into their palms, or simply drop their jaw in disbelief. Some of which did all of the above, including me. Venom was playable, and the gameplay was actually awesome. Albeit a little more tanky than I would have liked, but with each massive swing of his arms and pounding of his fists, I felt the raw power that only Venom can be known for, and the sheer strength Insomniac needed to nail if they truly wanted to include a playable Venom segment was there. Venom was expected to be slower than the typical Spider character, but what he lacked in speed, he mixed up in very obvious strength and tendril-based abilities, from being able to grab enemies at a distance and toss them about, to forming a shield to catch projectiles and toss them back, and then even using those said tendrils to bridge the gap in between platforms. And just when I thought the gameplay couldn't get any more raw, just look at those finishers. Yeah, this is not Tom Hardy's Venom. Those guys are dead. Waiting outside of Oscorp are the Hunters, more brutal fodder for Venom to eviscerate. But that can only mean that Kraven is not far behind. Lo and behold, if you weren't feeling Venom's power before, you'll definitely feel it now, Mr. Krabs, by being able to own Kraven in just a matter of minutes. And again, this is on spectacular difficulty, mind you. Sure, there's a little part of my brain that would have liked a better challenge, but how else are you going to illustrate that Venom means business? Well, by delivering one of the hardest scenes in a superhero game since Arkham Knight, and that was M-rated. Venom chews Kraven's head off, complete with blood and everything. You can see from my reaction here that not only was this shocking for a T-rated Spider-Man game, not only does this establish the stakes we'll face later on, but it kind of reaffirmed me that our favorite Canadian mutant will be in good hands. However, I didn't know that this would only signify a turning point for the game, one that would be in good hands as well. See, letting go of the reins of a playable Venom and putting us back into the shoes of the wall crawlers, something shifts within the game that took a minute to realize. The game became a bit more focused, centralized, and just outright better. I mean, think about it. Kraven was dead, so we had less villain clutter. Peter was cured of the symbiote, mostly, and we didn't really have to deal with the rushed elements of that arc anymore. And a common goal was being shared between our trinity of heroes. Stop Harry/Venom from what he perceived as healing the world. Though a lot of the activity around New York City can still be tossed up as a salad of varying design choices, mainly around the ones that the player has yet to complete from the previous acts carried on over, the story is much better streamlined in the third act and the stakes feel much more cohesive all around, prompting me to switch between Peter and Miles much more evenly than I was before. A lot of the story beats I was afraid would feel underbaked are now tied up pretty nicely. We already covered Kraven's gruesome exit, but Martin Lee is able to mostly make amends with Miles in a believable way. Sure, I'm still confused as to what the extent of Mr. Negative's powers are, even after a brief glimpse into his origins in the comics, but it managed to deliver on some pretty impressive visuals, new, albeit somewhat convenient powers for Miles, and a brand spanking new anti-venom suit for Peter, granting him the ability to keep his symbiote powers while being able to keep the aggression at bay. However, it's this exact suit that did make me bring up a concept often debated in the comic book community. Whether it be with the movies, the games, the TV shows, hell, practically anything that was lifted from a book with stenciled panels. A term often considered a bit of a swear word in the pop culture zeitgeist. We all know where this is going at this point. Fulfilling his role as Spider-Man's archenemy, the symbiote monstrosity sets out to terrorize New York, starting with those closest to Peter, in this case, Mary Jane. It's during this confrontation that we not only get Venom's iconic line, "We borrow," but also our first tie-in to what avid comic readers will recognize the most. McDonald's Scream. If you couldn't really tell from my verbal joust there, I'm frankly not very well versed in all of the symbiotes from Venom's comics as soon as he became the Lethal Protector. So MJ growing out that gooey hairdo was barely familiar to me. And this is what tipped me off to the question: is fan service in a game like Spider-Man 2 going a little too far? Well, it definitely threads the needle a little bit. There are some eloquent uses of it present here and there, from the audio logs between Kraven and his family every time you shut down a Hunter base, the mystery behind Mysterio's supposed reformation and whether or not it's true, and then my personal favorite, no, I'm not talking about the Howard mission, though this mission does deliver on bringing closure to one of my key nitpicks from the last two games by literally taking the pigeons to a new home outside of your vicinity. Howard passing away upon your return was somewhat predictable and could have landed a much more emotional gut punch than the way it was presented. I don't know. Maybe I'm a heartless bastard. Or maybe too many commenters ended up spoiling it for me in my last video essay prior to Spider-Man 2's release. Thanks a lot. No, that's not the side quest I was referring to at all. I'm actually talking about the Cult of the Flame. Returning to exact vengeance on the most evil of criminals as the vigilante Wraith, Yuri Watanabe tracks down a demented group of arsonists known as the Cult of the Flame, which is poetically fitting after Yuri sustained third-degree burns to her image after sporting that Karen haircut. But obviously there's going to be friction between Peter and Yuri at this point, since the symbiote is not there to egg Peter on to go with this, and the two reluctantly work together to bring the cult leader known as the Flame down to justice. However, his appearance during that final mission looks a little too familiar, even for me. If you look a little closely, you can see the machinations of my mind to put the formulas together and arrive at the deduction in real time. But I didn't want to say anything too prematurely, so I did the smart thing and waited. Waited for one of the best payoffs to a side mission in quite some time.
And when the crimson hour rolls over this earth, it shall bring truth, judgment, and carnage.
A very rewarding conclusion and a highly intriguing twist to one of the most recognizable villains, and one that modern audiences are now very well familiar with after some of his dips into some of the more mainstream stuff like movies and video games. However, this time sticking with Insomniac's tradition of taking the established lore and sort of flipping it in a fresh but sensical way. However, this was the final mission in the Cult of the Flame storyline within Spider-Man 2, meaning his proper introduction as the more nefarious and twisted symbiote won't happen until either Spider-Man 3 or, at the very least, some form of DLC expansion a la the first game. This leads me to my argument of how Spider-Man 2 does sort of push fan service into a sort of claustrophobic level. Are we at the risk of Spider-Man 3 the game suffering from the same fate as Spider-Man 3 the movie? Sam Raimi's movie, that is. For the uninitiated, Raimi's third film in the Webhead trilogy, which released back in 2007, was criticized for cramming too many villains and subplots into its storylines, ranging from the symbiote to Sandman to New Goblin, Gwen Stacy, and yes, at the last minute, Venom. Now I know that this is a feat much easier to pull off in a 20-hour game than in a 2-hour plus movie, but as pointed out throughout this essay, balance is key, and if the pacing is off as far as attention to character and pathos for each of these elements is concerned, it doesn't matter if it's a 5-hour DLC or 20-hour full-length title. We're going to notice. As much as I love the Cult of the Flame introducing this universe's version of Carnage, I started to get worried about figuring out other side missions and activities throughout the city that brought more chaotic comic book energy into the mix already. The spider bots that you've been gathering come from none other than another dimension, overseen by Lila, who casually name drops Miguel after collecting the collectibles. Kraven's drones were spying on seemingly different people only to reveal he was tracking down the enigmatic Chameleon all along, who still managed to slip away at the end and will likely need his own resolution as well. Then there's the greatest of the fan service nods within Spider-Man 2, one that most may not notice immediately or at all for that matter if they never played the game it's referring to. A Spider-Man game referenced rather cleverly when you take a stroll through Chameleon's hideout and take a peek at that sheet music. Can you hear the music? Spider-Man Web of Shadows. Literally, the entire third act of this game is an homage to the 7th gen Treyarch title, by having Venom spread his disease throughout the city and turning its citizens into his alien underlings. Whether you were a fan of that game or not, I personally thought it was okay back when I played it in 2013 or something. I may need to revisit to see how I feel about it now and maybe do a follow-up video essay on that, who knows. But that's the thing, regardless of your feelings towards Web of Shadows, there's no denying the similarities in tone, environmental changes, and enemy variety. Just slap that PlayStation 5 Insomniac coat of paint on, and we're practically there. This also introduces the symbiote nest activity throughout the city, a more challenging task that will definitely require you to upgrade and use the majority of your arsenal, and as much as I loved how it elevated my thought process approaching the gameplay and resourcing properly to make sure I can wait out the timer before the siren bombs go off, it failed to go any deeper than just more busy work to complete and reach that platinum. At least the story-based missions involving the nests have some form of cutscene to hammer home what's at stake, from saving Rio and Genki in the subway to taking back the station, and in the midst of this, Peter debuts what the anti-venom suit can do very effectively. After rolling credits, Insomniac does again have the fun thing in mind we were asking for, and gives you the ability to use either version of the symbiote suit, either the straightforward black suit or the much more goopy symbiote version. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself to mention the credits. We have yet to thwart Venom's plans with one of our own. Venom steals his precious the meteorite, covering all of New York in tendrils and prompting Peter, Miles, and MJ to hatch a plan to steal it back after Peter's last run-in with the alien villain. It also prompts the point of no return alert to stop if you aren't ready, similar to the prior games. Now, some may argue that the meteorite can be labeled as a simple MacGuffin at this point, but fitting into the context of this game means that our Spidey pals can serve as the distraction while the unlikely MJ goes in to get it, Resident Evil style. The over-the-shoulder perspective along with the sonar upgrade to MJ's taser gun brought up a lot of comparisons to the Capcom franchise, especially when its acclaimed Resident Evil 4 remake came out literally earlier that same year. Meanwhile, Miles fends off more symbiote cronies while Peter takes care of the big boss. A moment in the climax that still made many gamers, including myself, kind of feel bad for Miles. Even though it's not gameplay and it's mostly just cinematics, he was pretty much stuck with what's essentially cleanup duty. Peter, on the other hand, kicks off our final boss fight with Venom, and it's rather immaculate what Insomniac was able to pull off. See, it's not just Venom, but almost every boss fight is tense, rhythmic, brutish, powerful, and rather fun, except for that Kraven one in the woods I mentioned earlier. Environment is key in designing a good boss fight, and 9 times out of 10, a giant-ass tree would block the camera, causing me to miss the action and lose the fight. Other than that one, each brawl with our significant villains is able to make the grade as far as fulfilling the sense of power and scope it promises, and Venom's fight with Peter at Midtown High is no exception. Sure, you could argue that old habits come back to fulfill their role in the matter of pattern memorization and simply just attacking when the moment presents itself, but there would always be an extraneous element I would have to keep in mind, different than the rest, such as Lizard's unparryable strikes, or Venom turning a segment of the field into a sea of gnawing symbiote teeth you have to avoid. A little, as you can call it, video gamey, but I like to attribute it to the old arcade feeling of bombastic PS3 and Xbox 360 titles. Venom's final fight also makes excellent use of two pivotal gameplay mechanics: Peter's anti-venom abilities that have to be used on his white shield covering the health bar, and Miles, who finally has something important to do here. Both Spideys take turns whittling down each of Venom's phase using both ground and air techniques, and even a couple of little QTE moments for good badass looking measure. Punctuated by John Paisano's epic score going crazy, and MJ and Miles are able to fry the meteorite in the particle accelerator while Peter fulfills Harry's last request. He destroys the symbiote, and Venom is no more. The people of New York are turned back to normal, and the city is safe. And that's the question. Did Spider-Man 2 play it too safe? I guess in hindsight, we really shouldn't have worried about the safety of the sequel's story, but rather the safety of its own developer studio. On December 12th, 2023, Insomniac Games was a victim of a cyber attack, leading to almost 2 terabytes of data to be breached, including employees' personal information, prior game sales metrics, and future plans for both the upcoming Wolverine game and Spider-Man franchise. I want it to be clear that the employees' well-being and personal information is what's most important here. At the end of the day, these are just games that we're talking about, but when you start messing with employees' livelihoods, that's a whole different, much more serious beast, and must be dealt with as soon as possible. And since most of that leaked information revolving around Spider-Man 2, subsequent DLC expansions, and the likely third installment is pertinent to this essay, I won't go into too many specifics since I don't know what can and can't be talked about in a public video, since that's still technically under NDA information. Nevertheless, I won't be shying away from acknowledging it and pretending it didn't happen like so many outlets conveniently did, and there is merit to theorizing how the exposure of this information can have implications on where we see the lingering threads of Spider-Man 2 go in the future. It's pretty obvious that they're leaning into their version of the Green Goblin for their grand finale. And I mean real obvious. Is it even possible that Norman has no other colors besides green in his wardrobe? But I'll take the cheeky color-coordinated attire over the slightly forced conflict between him and the Spider-Men after Harry is left in a coma after the climactic fight. Seriously, you were asking him to save your son a few hours ago, and after doing so and blatantly seeing him alive, you snap on him on a dime like this and even rage out in the same room your son's best friend and his girlfriend are? This entire ordeal didn't really sit very well with me, and therefore it didn't make this meeting with Otto during the mid-credits scene as much of a ta-da moment as I thought it would be. Though I do respect it for two things. One, the subtle nod at the potential subtitle for the third game being quote-unquote the final chapter, and the theories it gave birth to involving the return of one of the most traumatizing moments in video games for many millennials growing up with a PS1. But that's assuming that Carnage isn't instead being placed in a DLC expansion as opposed to being a main villain in Spider-Man 3. Keep in mind that this version of Carnage was introduced in a side quest, and it's quite possible a good amount of players may enter the next full title without any knowledge of who he is. Then there's the nature of taking much more obscure spider people and throwing them into the mix. Our last end credits scene has Miles finally landing home base with Haley, but not before being interrupted yet again, this time by Rios' previously mentioned new boyfriend. A man named Albert introduces himself before turning the attention to his faceless daughter, before dropping the bombshell name, Cindy. Leading gamers to react one of two ways, like this.
Oh, and this is my daughter, Cindy.
Haven't finalized the character model. Good, because you have a habit of changing character models, Insomniac. Cindy Moon. Silk. Alright. Yeah, I don't feel like we've gotten enough Silk representation. And like this.
Cindy.
I feel like that's significant.
Okay, who's she? Who's Cindy Moon? I don't know! Who are these people?
As intrigued as I am in a different portrayal of Cindy Moon, aka Silk, outside of her comic run, she's also not very well known as Peter, let alone Miles, and could get lost in the shuffle in whatever plans Insomniac have for her. Is she going to be in a DLC, a single side mission across different episode expansions, a playable third character in Spider-Man 3? Some have even tossed up the idea of a spin-off for her character, but the player base's knowledge of her doesn't give any form of justification for that. If we're talking about spin-offs, we have to talk about the big boy himself, who was already playable to begin with. You're seriously going to tell me they designed the entire combat system around Venom? From finishers to symbiote attacks, parries, traversal, you name it, and not utilize it and expand upon it further? The blueprint is in fact quite laid out for the symbiote's own Miles Morales style spin-off, and though he met his canonical end in Spider-Man 2, something tells me we haven't seen the last of him. That is, assuming a lot of that information that was hacked is even true. And even if it was, how are we to assume plans, details, and release timetables won't fluctuate in an effort to keep things new, fresh, and surprising for the players? It looks like, despite what's being criticized as a safe ending for Spider-Man 2, Insomniac Games is just as uncertain about the future of the series as our players now. Generally, how the hero or heroes often feel at the end of a second act. Am I right? Here's what we do know. Peter is going on vacation while attempting to rebuild the Emily May Foundation, leaving spider-related duties around the city in Miles' hands. This led to many players wondering if Peter was even going to be playable going forward. More conflicted views on this decision arose when Insomniac themselves confirmed Miles will be the main Spider-Man for them going forward. Much like all of us, even wall-crawling superheroes needed to take care of their mental health, and a little R&R is needed. But this is still Peter Parker we're talking about, a character so many people of all walks of life have resonated with. And though I can't speak for every voice in the community that loves Spider-Man and Insomniac's rendition of the character as of late, the waters will prove to be troubled if Peter doesn't make some form of resurgence from his pseudo-retirement in Spider-Man 3. It would only give more ammo to those who are willing to tear down Spider-Man 2 and the developers behind it over questionable decisions in character backgrounds, inclusions, and messaging. I'm not going to open any kind of social can of worms. This isn't the video for that. But even I had to admit, there was the occasional plot element, background choice, or line of dialogue that made me at most, raise an eyebrow, simply just acknowledge it one time here in this video essay, and made me just hope that Insomniac's energy and focus was on the right path, rather than chasing whatever trend or viewpoint that works in the times that we live in. Spider-Man is one of my favorite superheroes of all time, and nothing is able to bring us close to living our dreams of becoming the friendly neighborhood wall crawler than the medium of video games. And with how far technology has progressed in the last decade, all of the tools are readily available to give players the ultimate experience of becoming Spider-Man, regardless of who is under that mask. What matters is that the person under the mask, whether it's Peter, Miles, or even Cindy, or whatever other character Insomniac hasn't addressed yet like Gwen, Miguel, or Ben, balances their notion of power with responsibility. Game studios like Insomniac are no different. They too must strike the delicate balance on delivering a game that the powers that be will be happy with, while also sticking with what feels true and authentic to the fans of Spider-Man. And despite my criticisms with all three entries in the franchise so far, I personally would say that they've managed to achieve that. The final chapter awaits, and the perception of a solid and fulfilling Spider-Man video game trilogy feels within reach. But we must all remember, both player and developer alike, balance should not just be the destination, it should be the journey. The journey to develop the strongest and most focused game, the journey to keep expectations tempered, the journey to become a much less toxic fan base, and the journey to become the fans of the video games Spider-Man would be proud to have.